Okay, so I am joined by the wonderful Nova Cadamatre MW and a flying winemaker of 5 states of the United States.
Currently only 2.
Currently only 2, but historically 5. And I really want you to talk about the fascinating history of the Finger Lakes in terms of the wine industry, its catalyst, and if you can take it through what it is up to today.
Absolutely. So historically speaking, the Finger Lakes was a very important wine growing area pre-prohibition for the U.S. It was the Champagne of the United States, primarily based, actually wholly based on native grape varieties. So Niagara, Delaware.
What was the big business? Was it Taylor's? What was it?
So there was Great Western was a big one. Taylor's is more post-prohibition.
Right.
But Great Western historically, Gold Seal historically, those were really important sparkling houses prior to Prohibition.
Okay.
Now, of course, when Prohibition happened, industry around the country shuts down, right? The challenge then became for New York, it's easier to grow wine in California. So when Prohibition was repealed, the California wine industry rebounded quite quickly.
Yep.
Whereas so much knowledge and information and just general industry guidelines had been lost in New York, it took a little longer for things to pick back up.
Now, did anybody during Prohibition survive? You know, in California we had those who did the legal loopholes of sacramental or medicinal purposes for wine,
right.
and the brick wine and all that kind of stuff. Did any of that exist, or did it all completely go down?
A little bit, very little though, existed with sacramental wine. It was not the same as the folks in California there were a few wineries that were able to kind of like limp along. Buena Vista is one of those that, they were able to do sacramental wine.
I just expected there to be better solicitors and lawyers in New York State.
You would think, but while there were wineries that were still operating under those premises, they were not shipping all over the country like California was. And so just the preparation for the repeal of Prohibition was much stronger on the West Coast than it was in New York, and even the Ohio River Valley went through a similar thing. That industry has not even remotely rebounded, even as far as New York has. So there's areas within the country that were very important for winemaking that you just don't even think about as wine regions anymore. But luckily, New York, kept some vineyards. And some of the wineries kept going, but really the modern era of the Finger Lakes really started in the 1960s and 70s when Dr. Konstantin Frank came over from Ukraine. And his story is so fascinating and amazing. And I love Megan. She's 4th generation running Dr. Frank's winery now, and their family history is just amazing. But you cannot talk about the modern Finger Lakes without talking about that family and how much they've put into who we are as a region these days. And we are growing vinifera now because Dr. Frank said we could,
Absolutely.
And it really was one of those things where his expertise was really key in making the industry what it is today.
We almost lost him to pot washing in New York City, though, because the first thing he did was working in the city just washing pots.
Yes, and then he
couldn't speak a word of English.
Yes, and then he became a janitor at the New York State Research Station in Geneva.
And got in through that door.
Exactly. So, I mean, you're thinking
that is just ambition and just creativity, isn't it, to do that?
Absolutely.
So he then purchases some land around Hammondsport. So this is like 120 acres, something like that. And it was like something silly, like $6,000.
Oh, yeah.
But of course,
back then,
quite a bit of money. Yeah. And then plants Vitis vinifera, right?
Yes.
So what's the next steps? What happens?
So after that, more and more wineries started planting, or more and more vineyards, I should say, started planting vinifera. The next big evolution that happened was the New York State Farm Winery Act. And I forget exactly what year it was, but that was the year that allowed vineyards to start making their own wine without having to apply for a full winery permit.
Right.
You still had to apply for a farm winery permit, but the excise taxes are much lower, and it's a little bit more of a friendly permit to
more
small
favorable
businesses. And so a lot of growers then turned into winemakers through that Farm Winery Act. Fox Run was one of those. Looked at Anthony Road. I think Lamoureux Landing potentially was one. So there's a lot of wineries that exist today because the farmers at the time said, oh, well, now we've got this ability to make our own wine, because that happened because things like Gold Seal and Taylor's, and when Coca-Cola pulled out of Taylor's Wine Company, they had bought from the Taylor family, that the volume of grapes going into that winery just completely disappeared.
Yeah.
And something needed to be done to save these family farms, and so that's where the Farm Winery Act came about. So that was the next big change in the history of the Finger Lakes. Now, when I came to the Finger Lakes in 2004, in 2003, Cornell had announced their undergraduate program in viticulture and enology. And so I think that was another big shift. Even though Cornell had been doing grape research for eons, there had not been a focus on actually generating vineyard people and winemakers out of it. It has always been more of a research-focused program. And so when they announced the bachelor's degree, that's when I decided to go to Cornell, because it's way closer on the East Coast than to go to Fresno or UC Davis, and I was already accepted to Cornell.
Yeah, you have UC Davis right there.
Right, let's go. And so then you start seeing more and more trained winemakers and viticulture people come out of Cornell and move not only into the Finger Lakes, but also all around the country. I was one of them. Michael Reedy, who worked at Hazlitt for a while, was one of the first graduates out along with me.
But it's great, isn't it? Then when people are going out to the world and getting more experience, or really sort of setting their scene, and wherever they may be, they list in their experience. Yeah, I went to Cornell, or I've worked in the Finger Lakes, and it becomes not just the fringe area, but it's actually a part of the whole story of the world of wine. Exactly.
And a lot of people don't realize this, but UC Davis and Cornell work very, very closely together on grape research, because UC Davis is the warm climate germplasm repository for grape DNA, and Cornell is the cold climate germplasm repository for grape DNA. So those two schools work together really closely to make sure that we're still capturing a lot of the genetic material from grape varieties that we may have lost in the general world of wine.
And up to modern days, what are the stats, if you have any to mind? What's the total acreage? What is the leading grape variety percentages? Those kind of things.
Yes. So I mean, we don't actually have up-to-date statistics. The last actual survey that was done by the state was about 10 years ago.
Oh, okay.
And so a lot has changed in the last 10 years, but we really don't know how much or what. But what I can tell you is the total AVA is about 5.4 million acres. It's a very, very large AVA covering the entire spread of the Finger Lakes. That being said, as of last checking, there was only about 11,000 acres of grapes planted in that 5.4 million acres.
Okay.
So there's a lot of space of open land that's not planted, not plantable in some cases, because you really need to be very close to the lakes themselves, within a mile, to get the warming influence of the lakes themselves. The other thing you have to think about with the Finger Lakes is, even though the Finger Lakes are very important to grape growing in an immediate way, Lake Ontario and Lake Erie are very important for our overall weather pattern. Yeah. And that's something that a lot of people forget about when you're talking about the Finger Lakes, because people focus on the Finger Lakes themselves, whereas Ontario and Erie, that often controls how our snowfall goes and the wind that we get over the area and things like that. And in 2003, when we had the big frost in the spring, the northern half of the lakes, which are more flat, got more of that wind off of Lake Ontario, and so the frost didn't settle. So there's very little damage in the north half of the lake, whereas the southern half of the lakes, because they were more on the slopes and more sheltered from those Great Lake winds, they got hit really hard because the cold air settled more. And so, the Great Lakes are also very, very important to our story, even though we don't focus on them quite as much.
I think there should be a petition to rename Ontario. It should not be a lake. It needs to be a sea.
It is an inland freshwater sea.
260 meters deep, but it's epic in size.
It is epic in size.
And of course, it's going to have a huge impact, like it does on Niagara, a huge impact in many positive ways and even negative, but it's just a significant factor, isn't it?
Well, you think about how large that lake is, and you said it's only 200 and something feet deep, right? Seneca Lake is 670 feet deep, just for a scale. It's obviously much smaller in surface area,
but very,
very deep. And that's why we're able to grow, because it's only frozen over 4 times in recorded history. So it absorbs heat during the summer.
That's right. Cuca does freeze, doesn't it?
Cuca does freeze.
Because that's shallower, but
yes.
then Seneca and
Seneca and Cayuga do not freeze. And
they're
even
deepest.
Cuca, the middle of it doesn't freeze. The edges do, the Y ends do, but the middle usually doesn't, unless it's an incredibly hard winter. But Seneca is so deep, it has this rotation of temperatures where it absorbs summer heat and then gives off that summer heat in the wintertime. And so the air around the lake is warmer by several degrees than the surrounding